let me begin by the title I've been given, which is Peace, Order, and Good Government. Of course, the defining theme of the British North America Act, Canada's original Constitution Act. You may be interested to know that Peace, Order, and Good Government, or POGG, was used in the British colonies beyond Canada, in New Zealand, Australia, in South Africa, and in Ireland. It was used as a term to confer general legislative authority. But in Canada, in particular, it has become something more than that. It has become to typify or summarize our approach to statecraft. We read in that clause a tradition of moderation, a preference for ordered development rather than revolutionary change, and an acknowledgement that government is for the common good. We consider it a distinct advantage of our Canadian patrimony. The peace, order, and good government phrase belongs in the part of our Constitution dealing with the division of powers. Section 91 in particular, which deals with the powers of the federal government, and Section 92 that enumerates the complementary provincial powers. As you well know, disputes between the federal and provincial governments have been a mainstay of Canadian political culture, and more recently between provinces and provinces, but I won't get into that. But tonight I wish to suggest that Sections 91 and 92 are not just a matter of technical assignation of jurisdiction, but rather, I think we can read here a vision of how to work together, of how to accommodate differences, and still yet within diversity to have a common overarching vision, to capture that vision of the United Empire loyalists who founded English Canada at the end of the 18th century of unity in diversity. There is a vision here that order does not mean uniformity, but rather making room for differences that can and must be respected. I speak in my partisan language often of renewing the Alberta advantage, which means that we have the capacity to try something different in Alberta that we believe is advantageous for our people. Others may choose other approaches and alternative policies. That's the beauty of a federation. That is what the division of powers allows us to do, to create a series of policy laboratories to pursue our own preferences and priorities. The Canadian constitutional vision is therefore, I submit, one of pluralism, meaning that there is not just one state actor, but several state actors, each with its own spheres of sovereign action. Good government is not monolithic government. Good government favors pluralism. Canada's federalism is an expression of the principle of pluralism in our constitutional order. Now, it's important to recall that this tradition of Canadian pluralism, for which we are known around the world — by the way, we just received a visit here in Calgary from His Highness Prince Karim the Aga Khan, who has established in Canada, not coincidentally, the Global Center for Pluralism. I was honored to work with His Highness for several years as the government liaison in that joint project between the Government of Canada and the Imamate of the Ismaili Shiite community, because he sees in Canada a model of pluralism which can be shared around the world to help to pursue the path of reconciliation in places of conflict. So we should be proud of this, but we should also understand how deeply this tradition of pluralism is rooted in our history. I'm concerned sometimes that we imagine this facile and superficial discourse about diversity is something completely contemporary, that we are somehow rejecting or cutting ourselves off from our past, when in fact modern discourse about diversity is rooted in an 18th century conception of pluralism. And in particular, in the Quebec Act of 1774. Now, following what our French-Canadian friends called la conquête, the conquest of New France, the British Crown imposed through the Royal Proclamation an assimilationist policy, an effort to rub out the differences in the former French colony, to marginalize the exercise of the Catholic faith, to prevent Catholics from obtaining public office, to suppress the French Civil Code and all of those institutions of civil society which the church had created the first school in North America, a result of the good works of Catholic nuns in Quebec City, Les Ursulines. The first hospital in North America, again, in the Quebec colony, the colony La Nouvelle France, founded by Catholic nuns. The first social welfare programs, starting the great tradition of which Pat Nixon personifies, started by people of faith in that church. And the new British regime following the conquest saw in those institutions a threat to their dominance of North America. And so, sadly, tried to rub those things out, tried to create instead of a pluralistic approach to society, a monistic approach with an oath of allegiance not only to the sovereign, the king, but also to his Protestant faith, which meant excluding 90% of the population of what we now call Quebec. But thanks to the enlightened advice of Guy Carleton, the British Parliament in 1774 adopted the Quebec Act, which was a complete reversal and was in many ways one of the most enlightened and small L liberal expressions of British liberalism and pluralism in the history of the empire. And basically the Quebec Act said that Catholics could take public office. They could be local notaries. They could be magistrates. They could serve the state. They could serve their fellow citizens and the common good without having to disavow their faith and their deepest convictions. It said that Quebec could retain the civil code and maintain a pluralism actually in the legal system with a binary system of the British common law, the French civil code. It said that all of those institutions of civil society, the nascent university, le Grand Séminaire de Laval, the schools, the Catholic hospitals could all function in cooperation with the state, and they did not have to choose between their conscience, their faith, and their ability to serve the public good. And this all happened in 1774 when in Britain itself, and in its closest colonies like where my Irish ancestors lived, the penal laws still prevailed, where Catholics could not take public office and where formerly their faith was suppressed. As former Premier Jean Charest said about the Quebec Act, Canadians made a decision very early in their history, a choice that over time has come to define the very essence of who we are. Our ancestors decided right from the start to build a country based on the right to speak a different language, to pray in a different way, to apply a different legal system, to belong to a different culture, and to enable that culture to flourish. He went on to say the Quebec Act of 1774 passed into law more than 2 centuries ago, almost 100 years before Confederation, is in this respect the most fundamental document in Canadian history. It is the foundation upon which the Canadian partnership was originally built. Its spirit defined this country from its inception. It represents one of the most enlightened decisions ever made in Canada. Interestingly, that very same act, because of its embrace of pluralism, was rejected by the 13 American colonies and was one of the efficient causes of the American Revolution. It was listed, it led directly to the First Continental Congress and is listed in this day in the American Declaration of Independence as, quotes, dangerous to an extreme degree to the civil rights and liberties of all America, because it allowed popery into North America. Well, that is that ring of intolerance. I have to pause to ask whether we are hearing echoes of that kind of intolerance in our political culture today. The same people who could not serve the common good prior to 1774 in Quebec because they would not take an oath renouncing the faith, would they qualify today for the Canada Summer Jobs Program? Would Rachel Harder, MP for Lethbridge, who was barred from chairing a parliamentary committee because of her convictions rooted in her faith, would she, is her experience returning to the sentiments that governed the northern half of North America prior to the Quebec Act in 1774? I'll let you answer that question for yourself. I think, though, that these are indications that we can never take for granted the generosity of spirit of our historically grounded pluralism. Now, I have to pause to say I'm aware that when I speak at a Cardis event, it's obligatory to refer to the Dutch Reformed tradition of Abraham Kuyper. Many good students here I can see, who spoke of the great notion of the spheres of sovereign action. The Dutch Reformed tradition identified with Kuyper, who was both a theologian and a prime minister, speaks of sphere sovereignty to describe that same principle of pluralism, not as a vision of government alone, but of the entire social order. It's not enough to have the principle of pluralism in levels of government. Rather, we must recognize that there are spheres of social action entirely outside of the state, and that have their own essential contribution that they make to the common good. For Kuyper, the government could only satisfy the common good alone if all that we had in common was that we were subject to the same government. But we have, as people, many higher and prior bonds to the community, to communities, beginning with the first community, as Aristotle called it, the family, and including our communities of faith, of commerce, of culture, of common purpose. Another term, perhaps more commonly used, that describes this notion is civil society. Civil society addresses the bonds that people form around common missions and common goals. And these societies are what comprise society writ large. Indeed, society writ large is not something that we encounter as often as the numerous societies in which we live. Our families, schools, companies, faith communities, sports teams, music groups, fraternal associations, social clubs, charitable ventures, what Edmund Burke famously called the little platoons. When he said in his reflections on the revolution in France, quotes, "To be attached to the subdivision, to love the little platoon we belong to in society is the first principle, the germ, as it were, of public affection. It is the first link in the series by which we proceed towards a love of our country and towards a love of mankind." So, with that in mind, as the leader of a new conservative party, I'm aware, very aware, of what I think is a false caricature of how modern conservatives think about society, namely that creativity, initiative, and responsibility lie only and exclusively in the market, and that government is a threat to all of that. This, I believe, is a kind of a thin, libertarian misconception of government that is something of at best, a necessary evil. And this is often caricaturized by reference to a distorted quote attributed to Margaret Thatcher that society does not exist. Well, that's not my vision, nor is it the vision of the renewed conservatism that I and many of my colleagues are proposing for Alberta. Our vision is not one of a great mass of individuals living between the market on the one hand and the state on the other. That vision only takes into account three aspects of society: the individual, the market, and the state. Therefore, if the market fails, the state must act, and if the state fails, the individual is left to fend for himself. It completely leaves out all that civil society does. Now, for someone in government, or someone who aspires to govern, it's easy to begin with what government can do. But I think that's the wrong question. The question of what should government do and what should government not do. The better question is this: what is the best way for civil society to flourish, to enable human flourishing, especially so that those who are most vulnerable are cared for? Then we can ask what the government might do to help make that happen. To put it another way, government is should be at the service of a flourishing civil society. That doesn't mean no role for government, but rethinking that role. I might point out that our hosts tonight, Cardis, devote considerable energy to thinking creatively about how government policy might lift up rather than displace civil society. To take one example, their research on childcare options focuses on what parents really desire, in contrast to what politicians and bureaucrats are determined to provide. I'd point out another example of recent Cardis research. They looked at the payday loan industry. I point that out because I think conservatives need to be reminded that markets too can fail to serve people well and can lead to exploitation. And policy instruments need to respond to such exploitation, especially of the vulnerable. The research that Cardis undertakes points us in a particular way towards the contribution that communities of faith can make to our common life. I would recommend that you look at the work they've done on the Social Cities Project, which argues persuasively that urban planning needs to take account of the institutions of civil society, particularly houses of faith. And the Cardis Halo Project has tried to quantify the contribution of faith groups. They didn't ask me for those advertisements, by the way. Yet we know that the deepest contribution of faith groups cannot be measured. It is possible to measure the value of the meal served to the poor, but that meal cannot be delivered in other ways. That meal could be delivered in other ways. Is not the real value the social connection, the personal touch, the bond of solidarity that comes with that meal? It is not a criticism of government to say that it cannot do that it cannot serve a meal. It is simply an acknowledgement that we need more than government to truly flourish as human beings together. And let me share with you a very personal example. Ray mentioned I studied in San Francisco. It happened to be in the late 1980s, during the AIDS crisis in that city. And through a friend of mine, I heard about a remarkable a place that had been established by a woman we now call, in the Catholic tradition, Saint Teresa of Calcutta, Mother Teresa. She established the first AIDS hospice in North America, the Gift of Love Hospice in South San Francisco. And through my friend, I began to volunteer there periodically and then semi-regularly on weekends, and we'd go down and do menial chores, doing the laundry and cleaning the floors, doing janitorial work, cleaning the dishes, just trying to help out these humble little nuns who Mother Teresa had flown in from India and Africa, and a few reflections about this. Now, first of all, this was the first AIDS hospice in North America. It was established at the height of the crisis, when men in particular were dying by the thousands every year with a disease that people still did not understand. At that time, HIV had not been identified when I started there. Some people still thought it was contagious. And yet these nuns, who grew up in some of the poorest communities on earth, flew to one of the richest communities on earth to do something that no government began. And why did they do it? Well, it was summarized in the name of their home, the gift of love. And I was transformed watching these humble, simple, often uneducated women from the third world giving their all to men who had often been abandoned by their families and their friends, who were alienated personally and spiritually, filled with anxiety and depression and a terrible disease. And I saw many of these men come to be reconciled with themselves, their families, and spiritually reconciled as well, not through any kind of proselytization, but simply with the witness of completely transformative, unconditional love. There is no government program and nothing in the market that can be a substitute for that love and what I witnessed and what changed me. And you know, to quote St. Teresa, what compelled her to establish that place? Not in moral judgment for what lives those guys might have led, but with unconditional love for them. What moved those young nuns from India and Africa to join her in that work was simply this. She said, quotes, "I see Jesus in every human being. I say to myself, this is hungry Jesus, I must feed him. This is sick Jesus. This one has leprosy or gangrene. I must wash him and tend to him. I serve him because I love Jesus. The simplicity of a mission of love. I suspect that AIDS Hospice would not receive Canada's Summer Jobs Program funding today. By the way, a little interesting Alberta note. Did you know that Mother Teresa, St. Teresa, visited St. Paul, Alberta in 1984, just 3 years before I ended up down there in San Francisco? And she, the local community raised some money to help her work abroad, and so she returned their favor with a visit. And they said that there were particular needs in the community with our First Nations people who were living in poverty and alienation. And so she ordered 3 of the nuns who were traveling with her to stay behind in St. Paul, and they still have a home there that cares for our Aboriginal people. Let me give you some other personal experiences of this, of how people moved by faith have done so much to allow for human flourishing in our pluralistic society. In 1978, the world saw the crisis of the Indo-Chinese boat people fleeing communist Vietnam by the hundreds of thousands. Tens of thousands died on the high seas, piracy and unsafe marine passage. And Canadians were moved. The government didn't have, however, at the time, the capacity to resettle through government programs large numbers of people. They just didn't. And so it was faith groups, faith communities. It was local churches of every tradition that stepped up to the plate and said something must be done to help these people who are dying as refugees. And so through their initiative, a great former immigration minister, Ron Akey, responded by creating what we now call the privately sponsored refugee program. And if those local churches raised enough money to cover the costs, and if they undertook to provide settlement support, integration support to those families,